Vanessa Pierce had been staring at the same error log for 11 minutes when Devon Castillo finally said the sentence that made the entire crisis reorganize itself in her head. The emergency response room on Cordant's 14th floor had the specific charged quiet of a team well past the point of easy conversation, 6 monitors throwing red across a room that had gone dim, except for the screens themselves, the low murmur of a conference bridge with 3 of Cordant's partner banks still open in the background, their representatives asking, every few minutes, for an update nobody in the room could confidently give. "We need Desmond," Devon said, not looking up from his own terminal. 3 other engineers crowded around the same bank of monitors, the company's core transaction ledger throwing errors at a rate that had, in the last 90 minutes, frozen payment processing for 4 of Cordant's 11 partner banks. "I don't know this part of the system well enough to fix it blind. Nobody in this room does. He built it." Desmond Faulkner, Vanessa said slowly, the name landing with a specific, sinking recognition she wouldn't fully understand the weight of for another several hours. "The systems architect. The systems architect I trained under for 6 years, Devon said. Still not looking away from the scrolling error log. "The systems architect you laid off 2 weeks ago." Vanessa looked around the room, at Priya Anand, who had gone quiet at the mention of the name, at Marcus Delgado, the newest hire on the team, watching the exchange without fully understanding its weight, at the error log still scrolling, unresolved, threatening to cost Cordant 4 banking contracts and an IPO timeline that had already been delayed twice. She thought about the spreadsheet she'd reviewed 8 weeks earlier, the one that had flagged Desmond Faulkner's compensation as the highest on the engineering team relative to his formal title, a principal systems architect designation that had read, to her, as exactly the kind of legacy overhead a pre-IPO cost review was supposed to identify and eliminate. "He built the ledger engine," she said. Not quite a question, the weight of it settling in her chest even before Devon confirmed it. "He built the ledger engine," Devon said, 22 years ago. "And then he spent every year since training the people who'd eventually need to understand it once he wasn't around anymore. Except none of us understand it fully, because the parts that actually matter right now were never fully documented, because documenting them was never prioritized by anyone above his pay grade, and now he's not here to ask. Some mistakes announce themselves immediately. Others take exactly the length of a crisis to fully reveal their shape, arriving in the specific form of a room full of capable people, all trained by the one person no longer in it, discovering together that competence built over decades cannot simply be replaced by a smaller number on a spreadsheet." To understand why Cordant Financial Systems' entire engineering team was, at that moment, quietly bracing for a conversation none of them wanted to have, you have to go back 22 years, to a converted garage in the outskirts of the city, where a 29-year-old Desmond Faulkner had written the first working version of what would eventually become the ledger engine, the core transaction processing system that now handled, on an average business day, over $4 billion in payment flows across 11 regional banking partners. Desmond had joined Cordant in its 2nd year, back when the company was 6 people and a modest office space above a print shop, hired specifically for his background in distributed systems and his particular methodical patience with the kind of edge cases most engineers preferred to ignore until they became emergencies. He had come from a mid-sized regional bank's internal technology division, where he'd spent 5 years watching, with growing frustration, how a large institution's own legacy payment infrastructure buckled under exactly the kind of edge cases nobody had bothered to plan for, small failures that the bank's own customers absorbed quietly, without ever understanding how close their own money had come to genuinely disappearing into a reconciliation error nobody had caught in time. That experience had shaped, more than anything else in his career, his conviction that the unglamorous, invisible work of preventing failure mattered considerably more than any feature a customer would ever actually notice. He had built the ledger engine's original architecture almost entirely alone over an 18-month stretch, working most nights well past what any reasonable schedule required, driven by a specific personal conviction that had shaped his entire career, that a payment system's job was never to be impressive. It was to be correct every single time, including in the rare failure scenarios that occurred perhaps once every few years, but that, when they happened, could not be allowed to lose a single cent of a customer's money. Cordant's early founders, still learning the business themselves, had trusted Desmond's judgment on this almost entirely, understanding, even in the company's leanest early months, that a payment infrastructure company's entire existence depended on a reputation for reliability that, once broken, would be nearly impossible to rebuild. He had built redundancies into the system that had seemed to some of Cordon's early investors excessive for a company still finding its footing, reconciliation checks that ran on schedules other engineers considered paranoid, edge case handling for banking holiday overlaps, and currency conversion timing mismatches that had, over the following 2 decades, prevented exactly the kind of catastrophic failures that occasionally took down competitors' systems entirely. One early investor, reviewing the company's technical spending during a Series B round, had questioned why so much engineering time was going towards scenarios that seemed, on paper, vanishingly unlikely to occur. And Desmond had answered, in a meeting several colleagues still remembered years later, that vanishingly unlikely and will never happen were not the same sentence, and that the entire value of the company he was helping build rested on understanding the difference. The system had never once, in 22 years, lost a transaction, a record Desmond privately considered the single proudest accomplishment of his career. One he had never once needed to advertise because the people who mattered, the partner banks, the regulators, the engineers who worked alongside the system daily, already understood exactly what that record actually meant. A system that never fails rarely gets celebrated for not failing. It simply gets trusted, quietly, by everyone who depends on it, until the trust becomes so complete that the person who built it fades into the background of an achievement everyone assumes will simply continue on its own. Desmond had spent the following 2 decades doing 2 things simultaneously: maintaining and gradually expanding the ledger engine's capabilities as Cordon's business grew, and training nearly every engineer who joined the growing technical team, a role he had never officially held, but had, over time, become synonymous with. New hires were assigned to shadow him for their first several months, almost as a matter of unwritten policy, and Devon Castillo, Priya Anand, and a dozen other current senior engineers across Cordon's technical organization had all, at some point in their careers, learned the fundamentals of distributed transaction systems sitting beside Desmond at his desk, watching him work through a problem out loud, absorbing not just his specific technical knowledge but his particular, unhurried discipline about what actually mattered when a system's correctness was the only thing standing between a company and a genuinely catastrophic failure. Devon remembered, specifically, his first month at Cordon 8 years earlier, when he'd proposed what he'd thought was a clever optimization to a piece of reconciliation logic, only to have Desmond walk him through, patiently and without a trace of condescension, exactly which edge case his optimization would have silently broken. An edge case that had occurred exactly twice in company history, and that Desmond could describe from memory down to the specific date and dollar amount involved. Devon had left that conversation understanding, for the first time in his young career, the actual difference between code that looked correct and code that had been tested against every failure mode someone had bothered to imagine. A distinction that had shaped how he approached every piece of work he'd done since. He had kept, in a private notebook he'd started that same week, a running list of what he'd started calling Desmond rules, small, hard-won principles about system design that Desmond had never formally taught as a course, but had transmitted, patiently, one debugging session at a time, across nearly a decade of working alongside him. Priya had a similar story from her own second year, a debugging session that had run past midnight with Desmond staying late, without being asked, walking her through a currency conversion timing bug, with the same patient, unhurried thoroughness he brought to every problem, treating her questions, even the elementary ones, with the specific respect of a teacher who genuinely believed that understanding built slowly held better than understanding rushed for the sake of a deadline. She had told Devon once, comparing notes over drinks after a particularly difficult sprint, that she'd worked at 2 other companies before Cordon and had never once encountered a senior engineer willing to spend that kind of unpaid, unglamorous time simply making sure a junior colleague actually understood something rather than just fixing it for her and moving on. He had raised his daughter Talia, largely alone since his wife Camille's death from ovarian cancer 6 years earlier, a loss that had reshaped his relationship to work in ways he'd never fully articulated to anyone at Cordon, choosing, in the years since, To decline every offer of a more senior management title specifically because the additional travel and late evening obligations would have cost him time with Talia he was not willing to spend. He had been offered, twice, a VP of Engineering title that would have come with a considerable salary increase and a seat in Cordant's executive leadership meetings, and had declined both times. Telling his then-manager plainly that he had already found the exact shape of work he wanted to be doing, and that climbing further up an organizational chart would trade time with his daughter for a title he had no genuine use for. He had remained, by choice, an individual contributor at the top of the technical ladder rather than climbing into an executive role. A decision that had made perfect sense within Cordant's engineering culture, where everyone understood exactly what Desmond's title actually represented, and that had made considerably less sense to a new chief executive reviewing an unfamiliar org chart 8 months into her tenure. A man who declines promotion to stay present for his daughter is making a trade most spreadsheets have no column for. Vanessa Pierce would learn, eventually, exactly how expensive that missing column could turn out to be. Vanessa Pierce had been installed as Cordant's CEO 8 months earlier, following the company's acquisition by a private equity consortium, preparing it for an IPO within 18 months, brought in specifically for her reputation as an operator who could modernize legacy organizations and tighten costs ahead of public scrutiny. She had built that reputation across 3 previous turnarounds, each one requiring exactly the kind of systematic, data-driven restructuring that had made her, by 41, one of the most sought-after operating executives in the private equity world's portfolio company circuit, a career built on trusting rigorous process over instinct, a philosophy that had served her well in 3 prior companies, where the underlying value genuinely had been visible in the numbers. Her previous role, turning around a struggling logistics software company over 2 years before its own successful sale, had earned her a reputation within the consortium as someone who could walk into an unfamiliar organization and identify, with unusual speed, exactly where inefficiency was hiding, a skill that had made her the obvious choice when Cordant's board began searching for a CEO capable of preparing the company for public markets. She had spent her first 2 months conducting exactly the kind of systematic review her mandate required: headcount audits, compensation benchmarking, an organizational restructuring designed to flatten what the private equity consortium's own analysis had described as an unusually senior, unusually expensive engineering organization relative to comparable fintech companies at Cordant's revenue scale. She had hired a restructuring consultancy with a strong track record across the consortium's other portfolio companies, trusting their methodology the same way she had trusted similar methodologies in her 3 previous roles, without fully accounting for the specific way Cordant's engineering culture differed from the more conventional organizations she'd restructured before. Desmond's name had surfaced in that review not because of any performance concern. His technical evaluations, when Vanessa's HR team eventually pulled them, were uniformly the strongest on the entire engineering team, but because his combination of tenure, seniority, and salary had made him, on paper, exactly the kind of legacy cost the restructuring mandate was designed to identify. Vanessa had approved his inclusion in the second round of layoffs based on a summary document that described him as a senior individual contributor with limited recent architectural output, a characterization built from a system that had, by design, required almost no visible architectural changes in years, precisely because Desmond had built it correctly enough the first time that it rarely needed them. She had not, in the weeks leading up to the decision, spoken with Desmond directly, relying instead on the aggregated recommendations of a restructuring consultancy the private equity consortium had retained specifically to conduct this kind of review at speed across the firm's portfolio companies. The consultancy's methodology weighted recent commit history, visible project ownership, and reporting structure prominently in its scoring, metrics that had, by their design, almost entirely failed to capture the specific foundational value of a man whose greatest contribution to the company had been built 2 decades earlier and maintained, quietly and without fanfare, ever since. She had reviewed 41 similar cases across the engineering organization that same week, trusting the aggregate methodology to surface genuine outliers, a level of trust that had worked reliably in her prior turnarounds and had, in this one specific and consequential case, failed catastrophically. A restructuring built entirely on visible metrics will always miss the value that lives in 20 years of institutional memory nobody thought to formally document. Vanessa had not made a malicious decision. She had made a mathematically confident one, built on a dataset that had never once been designed to measure the thing that actually mattered most. Desmond had received the news on a Tuesday afternoon, called into a conference room by an HR representative he'd never met before, informed in careful, rehearsed language that his role had been eliminated as part of a broader organizational restructuring, offered a severance package calculated according to a formula that gave no particular weight to 22 years of service beyond the standard multiplier. He had listened without arguing, understanding, in the specific way engineers understand systems, that whatever process had produced this outcome was not one a single conversation in that room was likely to reverse, and had spent his final 2 weeks at Cordant doing what he always did when facing a problem he couldn't immediately solve, quietly, methodically working through his own departure checklist, transferring what documentation existed, answering questions from junior engineers who kept finding reasons to stop by his desk during those final days. He had told Talia about the layoff that same evening, sitting with her at their kitchen table, explaining it plainly in language she could hold, that the company had decided they needed fewer people doing his kind of work, that it wasn't about whether he'd done a good job, and that they would be fine financially while he figured out what came next. Talia, 10 years old and considerably more perceptive than most adults gave her credit for, had asked only one question that evening that Desmond found himself unable to fully answer: whether the people he'd trained knew he was leaving, and whether any of them had said anything about it mattering. Desmond had told her, honestly, that a few of them had said something, quiet, awkward goodbyes in the hallway that he suspected had cost the people offering them more than they'd let on, and Talia had nodded, filing the answer away the way she seemed to file most things, carefully, without further comment, in a way that made Desmond wonder, more than once in the following weeks, exactly what she was actually thinking about it all. He had not, in those final 2 weeks, been asked by anyone in management to document the specific undocumented knowledge embedded in the ledger engine's oldest and most fragile subsystems, the exact sequence of manual interventions required during a rare currency reconciliation edge case, the specific historical reasons behind 3 deliberately unusual architectural decisions that had, over the years, prevented failures nobody outside Desmond's direct knowledge fully understood the danger of. Nobody had asked, because nobody managing his departure had understood there was anything left to ask about. Institutional knowledge rarely announces its own absence until the exact moment its absence becomes catastrophic. Desmond had spent 22 years being the answer to questions nobody outside his immediate team knew to ask. His departure did not remove the questions. It simply removed the only person who still knew how to answer them. The failure that brought Devon Castillo to the words "we need Desmond" had begun 11 days after Desmond's last day, triggered by an unusual confluence of factors that the engineering team would spend the following 72 hours trying, unsuccessfully, to fully diagnose. A partner bank's own system migration colliding with a scheduled currency reconciliation window in a sequence the ledger engine's oldest subsystem had been specifically, deliberately built to handle, using logic that existed nowhere in the current documentation, because Desmond had written it, tested it exhaustively, and simply never needed to explain it to anyone since the scenario had not recurred in over a decade. The first errors had appeared quietly. A handful of failed reconciliation checks that the on-call engineer had initially assumed were routine noise, the kind of minor discrepancy the system flagged and resolved automatically dozens of times a day. By the second hour, the failed checks had multiplied into a cascading pattern that took down processing entirely for one partner bank, then 2, then 4. Each failure compounding the last in a way that made the underlying cause increasingly difficult to isolate from the surface-level symptoms. Devon had been the one to escalate it to a full incident within the first 90 minutes, pulling in Priya and 2 other senior engineers, and had spent the following 2 hours watching the team's best diagnostic efforts circle the same fundamental gap. They could see what the system was doing wrong, but not why the underlying logic had been built the way it had, which made any confident fix impossible without risking a considerably worse failure. Priya Anand had been the first to raise the possibility that the failure traced back to code Desmond had written, recognizing a specific pattern in the error logs that echoed a story Desmond had once told her, years earlier, about a similar near miss in the system's second year of operation. She had spent 4 hours trying to reconstruct his reasoning from the code itself. A task made considerably harder by the specific, dense economy of Desmond's commenting style, written for an audience he'd always assumed would include himself. She pulled up the version history repeatedly, tracing commits back nearly 2 decades, looking for any trace of an explanation that might have survived in a commit message or an old internal wiki page, finding fragments but never the complete picture. "I can see what the code is doing," Priya told Vanessa, in the emergency response room, somewhere around hour 3 of the outage. "I can't confidently tell you why it's doing it that specific way, or what happens if I change it without understanding the reasoning behind a decision that was clearly deliberate. Desmond doesn't write accidental code. Every strange choice in this system has a reason. I just don't know what it is." The 3 partner banks still on the emergency conference bridge had grown increasingly pointed in their questions. By hour 3, one representative asking directly whether Cordant's technical leadership had confidence in a resolution timeline, a question Vanessa had been unable to answer with anything beyond careful non-committal language that she understood, even as she said it, was doing nothing to actually reassure anyone listening. A crisis has a specific way of clarifying, in real time, exactly what an organization actually valued versus what it merely claimed to value on an org chart. Cordant's entire engineering team understood, within the first hour of the outage, precisely how much of their own competence had been built on a foundation they no longer had access to. Vanessa left the emergency response room at hour 4 and drove, without calling ahead, to the address her HR system still had on file for Desmond Faulkner, understanding. With a clarity that had taken 4 hours of watching her most senior engineers fail to solve a problem she now understood only Desmond could reliably solve, exactly how badly she had misjudged the situation 8 weeks earlier. She rehearsed the conversation twice in the car, both versions sounding, to her own ear, considerably more composed than she actually felt, and arrived at a modest, well-kept house in a quiet residential neighborhood 20 minutes outside the city, a basketball hoop mounted over the garage, a porch light already on against the early evening. Desmond answered the door in casual clothes, Talia visible behind him at the kitchen table doing homework, and looked at Vanessa with the particular, unhurried stillness of a man who had clearly expected, on some level, that this conversation might eventually happen, without having spent the intervening 2 weeks waiting anxiously for it. "Ms. Pierce," he said, "I imagine this isn't a social visit. The Ledger Engine's core reconciliation subsystem has been down for 4 hours, Vanessa said. 4 partner banks are threatening to pull their contracts by end of week if we can't restore full processing. My team has told me, repeatedly, that they don't have the knowledge to safely resolve this without you. I came here to ask you to come back." Desmond was quiet a long moment, the particular stillness of a man deciding how to answer something honestly rather than conveniently. He glanced back toward the kitchen, where Talia had gone still over her homework, clearly listening despite pretending otherwise. "I'll ask you something first," he said, turning back to Vanessa. "Did anyone, at any point during my layoff process, ask what specific knowledge I held about that system before deciding my role was redundant?" "No," Vanessa admitted. "The review was based on aggregated metrics. Nobody involved understood the system deeply enough to know what to ask." "That's the actual problem," Desmond said. "Not that you laid me off. Companies restructure. I understand that better than most people, 22 years in this industry. The actual problem is that the decision was made by people who had no way of knowing what they were actually deciding, because nobody ever built a process for capturing what I knew before deciding whether I was expendable. Some corrections require more than an apology. They require a person willing to name plainly exactly what the mistake actually was, rather than settling for the easier, vaguer acknowledgement that something had simply gone wrong. I'm not asking you to come back on the same terms, Vanessa said. I'm asking what it would actually take. I understand that's a different question than the one I should have been asking 8 weeks ago. Desmond considered this for a long moment, glancing back at Talia, who had looked up from her homework, watching the conversation with the same careful attentiveness she brought to most things involving her father's work. 3 conditions, he said finally. First, I come back as a consultant, not an employee, on my own schedule, with the authority to say no to any deadline that would require cutting a corner I'm not willing to cut. Second, before I fix anything today, someone on your team starts recording every piece of undocumented knowledge I still hold, on video, in real time. So this specific failure mode, of losing an entire company's institutional memory in one layoff decision never happens again, to me or to anyone else. Third, he paused. You personally sit through at least one of those documentation sessions, not because I need an audience, because I think you need to understand firsthand exactly how much of what actually keeps a company like this one solvent lives in places a spreadsheet will never find. Vanessa did not hesitate. Agreed. All of it. Talia, from the kitchen table, called out without looking up from her homework. Are you going back to fix it, Dad? Looks like it, Desmond said. Good, Talia said, matter-of-factly, already turning back to her worksheet. You always said the important stuff isn't written down anywhere. Guess they figured that out the hard way. Vindication rarely arrives as simple reinstatement. More often it arrives as a negotiation, conducted on the wronged party's terms rather than the terms of the person who caused the harm. Because real correction requires more than restoring what was lost. It requires making sure the specific blindness that caused the loss cannot simply repeat itself the next time someone reviews a spreadsheet without understanding what the numbers actually represent. Desmond walked back into Corden's offices 2 hours later. Talia dropped at a neighbor's for the evening, and the specific quality of the room's reaction when he entered the emergency response floor told him everything he needed to know about how the previous 4 hours had gone without him. Devon Castillo stood up from his terminal so fast his chair rolled backward into the desk behind him. Priya Anand simply said his name, once, with the specific relief of someone who had spent 4 hours holding a problem she genuinely hadn't known how to solve alone. Marcus Delgado, the newest hire, watched the reaction of his colleagues with the particular curiosity of someone finally understanding, in real time, exactly whose absence had been shaping every conversation in the room for the past several hours. Walk me through what you're seeing right now, Desmond said, pulling a chair up to Priya's terminal without any further preamble. And the room reorganized itself around him with the specific, immediate deference of engineers who had spent years learning that Desmond Faulkner, presented with a hard problem, was usually the fastest route to an actual answer. He listened to Priya's full summary for 6 minutes without interrupting once, occasionally asking a clarifying question. His eyes moving across the error logs with the specific, unhurried focus of a man reading a language he'd been fluent in for over 2 decades. He pulled up the version history himself, scrolling back through commits with a speed that suggested he still remembered, roughly, where in the codebase's history to look, and stopped on a change dated 18 months earlier, a small, unassuming commit with a message that read simply cleanup, remove unused legacy check. This, Desmond said, tapping the screen. This wasn't unused, it was rarely triggered, which isn't the same thing. He found the failure within 40 minutes, a currency reconciliation edge case interacting with the partner bank's migration in a sequence the system's oldest subsystem had been built to catch. Except the catch condition had been quietly deprecated 18 months earlier by an engineer who had never fully understood why it existed and had removed it as part of an unrelated cleanup effort, a change that had passed code review, because nobody reviewing it had the specific historical context to recognize what was actually being removed. This is exactly the kind of thing I meant, Desmond said, showing Priya the deprecated code in the version history. Nobody did anything wrong here, technically. The reviewer approved a change that looked, on paper, like reasonable cleanup. But the reason this catch condition existed lived entirely in my head, and once I wasn't here to flag it, there was nothing left to stop it from getting quietly removed. So the fix is putting it back, Devon said. The fix is putting it back correctly, Desmond said, which means understanding exactly why it was built the specific way it was built the first time, not just restoring the old code and hoping it still applies to the system as it exists today. Give me 90 minutes. He rolled up his sleeves, the specific, unhurried motion of a man settling into work he'd done 1,000 times before, and pulled a second monitor closer, cross-referencing the deprecated logic against the partner bank's current migration documentation with the same methodical patience Devon remembered from his earliest days at the company. Priya pulled up a chair beside him without being asked, watching him work through the reasoning out loud, narrating each decision the way he always had, understanding that she was, in effect, receiving the exact kind of unhurried mentorship session she hadn't realized how much she'd missed until it was suddenly back in the room. The fix itself took another 90 minutes, restoring processing to all 4 affected partner banks before the end of the business day, Desmond working through it with the same methodical, unhurried thoroughness that had defined his entire career. testing each incremental change against a battery of edge cases before moving to the next step, refusing. Even under the pressure of 4 banks threatening to skip a single verification step he considered necessary. A crisis rarely rewards the fastest possible fix. It rewards the fix built by someone who understands exactly what they're risking by moving quickly and chooses, even under pressure, not to. Desmond spent the following 3 hours, at his own insistence, walking Priya and Devon through the reconciliation subsystem's full undocumented logic, recorded on video exactly as he'd requested, while Vanessa sat in the same room for the entire session, taking notes on a legal pad the way she hadn't done since business school, absorbing, slowly, exactly how much of what she'd been asked to evaluate on a spreadsheet 8 weeks earlier had never once been visible in the data she'd actually been given. She watched Desmond explain, in careful, patient detail, the specific historical reasoning behind 3 separate architectural decisions that had each, at some point over 2 decades, prevented a failure that would have cost the company far more than his entire salary across his tenure combined. Watched him field questions from Priya and Devon with the same unhurried generosity he'd apparently brought to every teaching moment across his 22 years at the company, and understood, somewhere around the 2nd hour, that she was watching something considerably more valuable than a bug fix. She was watching the specific, irreplaceable process by which institutional knowledge actually got transferred from one generation of engineers to the next, a process that had, until 4 hours earlier, existed entirely inside one man's head, protected by nothing more than his own continued presence in the building. At one point, well into the 2nd hour, Vanessa asked a question herself, tentatively, about why a particular reconciliation window had been set to the specific interval it used, rather than a rounder, more intuitive number, and Desmond answered her exactly as he answered Priya and Devon's questions, patiently, completely, without any hint that her question was less worthy of a full explanation, because she wasn't an engineer. She found herself, by the end of that answer, understanding a piece of her own company's infrastructure more deeply than she had in 8 months of executive briefings, and recognized, with a specific discomfort she chose not to look away from, exactly how much easier it would have been to simply ask questions like that 8 weeks earlier, before a decision had already been made. Some lessons only fully land when a person sits through the specific, unglamorous detail of what they nearly lost. Vanessa Pierce had approved Desmond Faulkner's layoff in 11 minutes, based on a summary document. Understanding what he actually knew took her 3 hours of direct, careful listening, and she suspected, by the end of it, that the ratio itself was the entire lesson. Cordant restructured its engineering documentation practices over the following quarter, building, at Desmond's continued consulting insistence, a formal knowledge transfer requirement for any departing senior engineer, regardless of the reason for their departure, a policy Devon Castillo helped design and that the company eventually named, informally within the engineering organization, the Faulkner Protocol, a title Desmond found genuinely embarrassing and never once managed to talk anyone out of using. The protocol required, at minimum, 2 weeks of recorded knowledge transfer sessions for any departing senior engineer, sessions structured around a standard set of questions designed specifically to surface exactly the kind of undocumented reasoning that had nearly cost Cordant its 4 largest banking contracts in a single afternoon. Devon, promoted to principal systems architect the following year, a title he accepted only after making sure Desmond had genuinely moved on to consulting work he wanted to be doing rather than a role he'd been quietly pushed out of, spent considerable time in his first months building out the protocol's documentation templates, drawing directly on the 3 hours he'd spent recording Desmond's knowledge during the outage as the model for what a proper knowledge transfer session should actually look like. "I used to think documentation was something you did when you had extra time," Devon told a new engineering hire during an onboarding session 18 months after the outage. Pulling up the recorded video of Desmond's marathon knowledge transfer session as part of the standard training material. Desmond taught most of us everything we know without ever writing half of it down, because he was always here to ask. We learned, the hard way, exactly what that costs a company the day he wasn't. This video you're about to watch exists because 4 partner banks nearly walked away in a single afternoon, and I'd rather you understand why it matters than just follow the protocol because it's policy. Talia, 10 years old and considerably more interested in her father's work than most children her age, liked to tell her class, during career day presentations, that her dad got fired, and then the company realized they couldn't actually run without him, a version of the story she delivered with the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of a child who understood the ending mattered more than the middle. That's not exactly the whole story, Desmond told her, the first time he overheard the retelling. It's the important part, Talia said, entirely unbothered, and went back to her homework. Vanessa, 18 months later, standing in front of the same private equity consortium that had once approved the restructuring mandate that cost Desmond his job, presented Cordant's pre-IPO technical readiness review with a specific line item she had insisted on, including over her own consultant's objections, a documented, formalized valuation of institutional engineering knowledge, built directly from the lesson of a 4-hour outage and the specific cost of nearly losing it permanently. The consortium's partners had initially questioned the value of including something so difficult to quantify in a formal readiness review, and Vanessa had walked them through the outage's full financial exposure, the 4 contracts nearly lost. The specific dollar cost of the 90 minutes it had taken Desmond to fix what her entire remaining engineering team, working together, had failed to diagnose across 4 hours. I made a decision 18 months ago, based on the best data I had at the time, Vanessa told the consortium's partners, in a meeting Devon later heard about secondhand and repeated to Desmond with visible satisfaction. The data was wrong, not because anyone lied to me, but because nobody had ever built a system capable of capturing what actually mattered. I'd like this company to be the kind that builds that system anyway, even when it's harder to put on a spreadsheet than headcount and salary. The consortium approved the readiness review without further objection, and Cordant's IPO proceeded on schedule the following spring, with a technical risk assessment section that competitors' bankers would later describe, privately, as unusually thorough for a fintech infrastructure company of its size, a thoroughness that traced directly back to a Tuesday afternoon outage and the specific, hard-won humility of a CEO willing to name her own mistake in front of the people who had trusted her judgment to prevent exactly this kind of failure. One of the consortium's senior partners, reviewing the final readiness document weeks before the offering, remarked to a colleague that he had rarely seen a portfolio company CEO include a section explicitly documenting her own prior misjudgment, and that the inclusion, rather than undermining investor confidence, seemed to have the opposite effect entirely, signaling exactly the kind of institutional self-awareness public markets rarely got to see this candidly before a company's first earnings call. A mistake, fully understood and genuinely corrected, does not erase the harm it caused. It simply becomes, if the person who made it is willing to do the harder work of actually learning from it. The reason the next mistake of exactly that kind never gets the chance to happen at all. Desmond Faulkner walked back into Cordant Financial Systems on his own terms, not because the apology alone was ever going to be enough, but because he understood, better than almost anyone in that building, that a system built correctly the first time was worth considerably more than a system merely restored after it broke. Vanessa Pierce learned, in the space of a single afternoon, that a spreadsheet could tell her everything about what a person cost, and nothing at all about what they were actually worth, a distinction that took 22 years to build and less than a decade to nearly lose in 11 careless minutes.